So this is a new one. Several days ago, I left work, went to start my car, and the key didn't want to go into the ignition hole. I just kind of wiggled the steering wheel a little bit, and then it popped right in. And I thought to myself, oh, that was kind of strange, but whatever. And then went to a work happy hour. Happy hour turned into me leaving around 10 p.m. Hopped in my car and could not get the key in the ignition. Tried wiggling the wheel some more. Spent probably an hour messing with it. Couldn't get it to work. Had to leave it overnight. Came back the next day. Pulled off the covers here. Tried just about every trick I could find on the internet. Turns out the steering column lock is sticky and it's not engaging the lock mechanism. And when that happens, there's a little mechanism in the key hole in the tumbler that prevents you from sticking the key in. So I came back, it spent like, I don't know, maybe an hour or so trying various things, wiggling the steering wheel, sticking a bobby pin in the keyhole to try to trigger that mechanism. And at the end of the day, could not get it to release. I guess there is a trick where you can drill, there's a spot in the bottom here where you can drill a hole and somehow, I haven't looked into it, but manipulate that mechanism to get it to work. But long story short, have to replace this piece, which I have here. And I am missing that plastic bushing seal. I would transfer the one from my old piece to here, but I think mine is actually a little bit damaged from a previous project. It's creaking and squeaking when I turn the wheel, so I'm going to be getting a new one of those. But this should solve my issue, so I'm going to swap this out and hopefully all goes well. This is the steering column locking mechanism, so I anticipate mine has failed. There's maybe a spring in there that has failed, or even debris from this seal, which has been compromised. Stuff from that could be in here and gunking it up and messing things up. So we'll see. First step for replacing this is removing the airbag. Mine looks a little bit different because I have an X3, an E83 X3 steering wheel with the heat. And to release the airbag, there's two little holes on either side here. So the trick is to stick some sort of a tool in there to release the tangs, which I've already done, and that pops out. You undo the two connectors on the back here with a small pick or screwdriver to lift up on these little bits here. Quick tip on removing the airbag. Now that I have it apart and it's easier to show you, I just use one of these little Torx tools in this hole, and as you can see, it can be a little bit difficult to line up. But once you get it lined up, it pushes on the spring, which releases those clips. One thing to note is that before you remove the airbag, you will want to disconnect your battery, otherwise you'll trigger an airbag code. So you get an airbag light on the dash. In my case, I'm too lazy to disconnect the battery, so I'm going to be clearing the code afterwards once I get everything back together. Next up, you'll want to undo these three connectors. Most people will have two connectors here, unless you have a heated steering wheel or SMG with paddle shifters, which is not a thing on the E53, but I have heard of people retrofitting that. Like I mentioned, I already removed my steering column covers, but this is pretty straightforward. You have a small Torx screw here on the bottom, and then these four holes correlate to these little clips on this piece here. So you can easily snap those out. Mine is broken. I think I have a replacement in the basement, so I'll swap that out while I'm in here. The top is similar. There's an annoying little plastic screw, Phillips head screw, that goes on the top here. I might swap mine out for something a bit more robust, but it basically activates these little this little clip here into that square hole. So that comes out pretty easy. And then there are four more holes like the bottom with little clips that once you pry this up, it's pretty easy to get in there with just a needle nose and squeeze these in and pop it right out. Next up, we have the 16mm bolt here. This can be super tight. In my case, I was able to grab onto the steering wheel and reef it loose. If your steering wheel lock is not working like mine, this can be challenging. I was able to get it. Had I not been able to get it, I was probably going to bump it with the impact, but you'll be able to remove that next. Once you remove that bolt, you will notice that there are some notches on both the column shaft and the steering wheel casting right about here that help you line up the steering wheel straight. So just make a note of that as you're removing it. Make sure that they are lined up initially, and then when you go to reinstall the steering wheel, that those are also lined up. Next up is to remove the clock spring. Try not to spin this too much. I don't know if it actually matters on this style of clock spring, but some cars this can be an issue if you turn it too much without the everything connected. And to remove this is just 4 Torx screws here and here, and then undoing all the electrical connectors and pulling that off, setting it off to the side. As far as connectors, we have this green plug here, this white plug right here, another white plug here, and a black plug on this side. Looks like there's one more thing. In removing this, I realized there's one more little red clip there. Another little pro tip for better access to this, I'm going to make sure this is lowered all the way and push that all the way. Next up is to undo other electrical connections. There was a zip tie right here that I snipped, and then removing the ignition switch, and then there's a plastic bracket here as well that needs to come off. And these bolts are a T27 Torx. Getting this EWS key sensor ring off can be a little bit nerve-wracking. Whoop! I was actually able to pry a little bit from here against this edge here to get that started to pop off. And yeah, it just kind of clips on with tangs around this lip here. So it can be a little bit tricky. Try not to reef on it too hard. And yeah, start here where you have this ledge up here to pop that up and kind of work your way around. It should pop right off, and then undo that connector, obviously. So in my case, I think I'm gonna leave the ignition switch on this piece as I take it out, make it a little bit easier. You will wanna remove this little spacer. Looks like there's a little groove on there. So I'm gonna make sure that that groove goes in to that snap ring there. Put that there. So I'm gonna leave this on, and this is kind of an oddball. These typically go on with shear head screws. So there are Torx head screws where once you get them tight enough, the head actually snaps off and you just have kind of a rounded button head with no features on it. For whatever reason, mine has these socket head Allen bolts. You know, I'm not complaining, but maybe this has been done before. And that's why these screws are in here. So it'll be a little bit easier for me. I don't have to grind them or use a punch to get them loose. I'm just gonna remove these, pop off this little top bracket, and I'll be able to slide. Actually, I do have to get the snap ring out, so that's a bit complicated. Once I get that out, I'll be able to slide this off and take a look at it. Now, I don't necessarily advise this method because this die casting might not be strong enough to take the kind of pressure from this, but using a pry bar like this allows you to pull this back and then release that snap ring. And in my case, I'm gonna try using one of these. This does have tips you can swap out. Unfortunately, there isn't anything that really will grab onto this as well as I would like, but I'm gonna give it a shot. So this is requiring a little bit of finesse with only 2 hands, but basically I used the snap ring pliers to spread that out as much as I could, and I actually relieved some of the pressure and let that go entirely, and that pushed the bottom edge of this snap ring out. So now I can pry it out. I can get a small screwdriver underneath that, into that gap, and then hopefully just very calmly snap that out of place. Looks like it's working. Start from that bottom edge with a small screwdriver and just kind of slowly prying that snap ring up and out of the groove. With a combination of prying and using this to put a little pressure on it, was able to pop that off. Once that snap ring is out of the way, we have another spacer, and this has a groove for that snap ring. So take that into account when you put it back together. Again, I got super lucky in that my X5 has these Allen head bolts. So it's a 6mm. I'm gonna undo that, take off that top plate, and this should slide right off. Bolts are out. This top cover should slide out. You have to kind of slide it back and then remove that. Come right off. And look at that, my steering lock mechanism is jammed. It looks like there's some debris in there. Once you loosen these flathead set screws, this ignition switch should pull right out. These can be really tight, so just keep that in mind. I had to use a little trick with this flathead and a vice grips to get enough leverage to actually get these loose. But so I'm still not 100% clear on what's going on. We have the steering lock mechanism. This moves up and down. So you push it down to a certain point. There is a pin, and when I pulled it out, this pin was engaging the lock. It doesn't seem to want to pop out at this second. So this is a little bit weird. That little pin didn't want to engage when this is installed, but if I slide this, it pops right into place. So I think it has to do with this little window and the shape of that mechanism and this feature on the shaft, which I'm assuming it needs to move a little bit to engage that pin. And one thing I noticed is that this spring seems to maybe be a little bit wonky. That could be causing the issue. And I still can't get the key in, so maybe I can try shifting, pulling on this, pull it back, and get the key in there, so see if that works. All right, it definitely took some wiggling to get that in there. So kind of not sure at this point of what's worn out. It might be something inside here. So this is a little odd and maybe telling us what's going on, but when I turn the key, it's kind of hard to do this with two hands, but as I cycle the key back and forth while holding this down, that pin does not retract, which I feel like would need to happen as you're turning the key. So that could be the issue. But again, I'm gonna swap everything over to the new unit and see if that clears it up. This next part is really finicky. So to get the ignition lock cylinder out, you basically have to turn the key and try to stick a rod into this small hole until you get to the point where you feel it kind of come all the way through. And then you can pull out that lock cylinder. I initially tried using a bobby pin, but I think the profile of this wasn't right. It wouldn't fit through that last hole to unlock it, and then these features were kind of causing unnecessary friction. So use a paper clip, of course, gold plated because we're bougie. And once I was able to wiggle that and feel it slide all the way in, that allows you to pull this out. And again, that last hole on this feature, it's pretty small, so I definitely would recommend a paper clip or similar gauge wire for that. Again, a closer look at the spring. It looks like it's actually broken, so probably was not helping things. And there it is. So after seeing this, I feel like I maybe could have pulled off the ignition switch and pushed on this end to get things to release properly. For installing it, you want to make sure that this tab somewhat aligns with the position of this when you put this in. That area, that little bumped out area with the white feature that locks out the key, that's going to align with this little groove here. So when you install it, put that in. Again, it helps if these tabs, the tabs that move, helps if those are lined up. And if they are lined up, should wiggle into place and fit all the way down into the cavity. And you can pull your pin and you're in. And now that we have a properly functioning assembly, we can see that lock engage, disengage without issue. So, lifetime warranty on this because I bought it from ECS. Hopefully I don't need to do this again, but if I do, now I know how to do it, and hopefully you do too. After several days of waiting, I decided to pick up a replacement bearing. This is the old one. It's pretty dried out. I could lubricate it. I did notice that there is one ball bearing missing, and I know that I put extra attention on this bushing bearing when I was doing my when I had my front steering rack and subframe dropped and stuff like that. The steering column was definitely, there was tension on it. I'm pretty sure it was pulling on this bearing, causing some wear. So went ahead and ordered a new one, got one off ECS. I could have got it sooner from the dealer, I think, but saved a little bit of money buying from ECS, and they have that lifetime warranty now, so might as well. Also picked up a new ignition switch. I don't suspect any issues with mine currently, the current one from my car, but while I'm in there, you know, it's been 20 years. Might as well replace a 20-year-old part that has, you know, 160,000 miles on it with one that's brand new. Little peace of mind there. So with that, I'm gonna get started with putting that new bushing in and putting everything back together. Since I work on a lot of bikes down here, I do have some bike grease that I'm gonna apply to this to make it a little bit easier. I still think I'm gonna have to apply some pressure to get it pressed in though. Now I do have a theory that once I assemble everything and torqued on the steering wheel that it would press this in place, but I don't want to take any chances, so I'm going to use the outer race from the old bearing to help me out and create a little standoff here. Next up is the ignition switch. The new housing here, lock housing, did not come with the set screws that kind of hold the ignition switch in place. So I'm gonna have to pull these. They do have like kind of Loctite on them and stuff. I'm just gonna transfer them over. They should be fine. Should also note that this little clip needs to swap over to the new unit as well. Now that we have the new assembly, putting everything back together will be a matter of reversing operations. I'm actually going to go ahead and stick the key in here to get the lock to pop down, and it will make it easier to slide on and get everything into position. Now without that top plate on here, it does fit a little loose, but you can kind of see when it bottoms out based on these two parts and their interface. I think I will pull the key out and see if that helps hold things into position a little bit. And then next step is to pull this out and get that snap ring on. Since this is a telescoping column, it's kind of really shoved in here, kind of recessed. So what I'm going to do is use the steering wheel bolt with one hand on here. I'm going to pull that out, and you can see the groove for the snap ring. So with the steering wheel bolt out of the way, let's put this spacer back in place. The one with the groove in it. Other side is flat. Put that on there. I'm going to kind of get the snap ring into position. Again, I'm not sure if I'm going to have to do any other crazy setup to get this to work. But again, I do not advise this method because it puts a lot of strain on this die casting here. All right, that worked. What I did was I just worked my way around here, put a lot of pressure onto the snap ring, and it snapped into place. Next up is putting this top plate back on. And again, the proper fastener for these is actually a shear head Torx bolt. So once you get it torqued to the proper spec, the head kind of snaps off and leaves just a smooth button. But I'm not going to use those. I'm going to reuse these that were actually on my car. So this part does have this tab that kind of slides into a slot here. And there you can see a little slot that it slides into. So I'm not sure on the torque spec for these. They weren't super tight. I think for this kind of a application, just really use your best judgment. Good and tight, but don't strip it out. They are going into aluminum, steel bolts going into aluminum. So use your best judgment here. I would use my little impact, but I want to make sure this goes on evenly and doesn't get crooked or anything weird like that. It's also nice to feel how tight it's getting. When I took it off, I was kind of surprised. It was, you know, snug, but not necessarily like, tight. Also, do not forget to put this little spacer on. As mentioned, there's a little groove on there, which interfaces with the snap ring. All right, I've discovered a little wrinkle in my plan here. The holes for this bracket are not tapped. Instead of taking this off and actually tapping all these holes, it looks like these holes are sized in a way that the threads of the bolt, fit just snug and will kind of cut their own threads. So I've got the bottom one started. This does result in some aluminum shavings coming off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap it. I'm going to run the bolts into both holes, take it out, clean everything up, try to get rid of the aluminum shavings, and go from there. I assume this is a cost-cutting measure so that they wouldn't have to do another operation on this cast part by adding those tapped holes. All right, we definitely have a lot of aluminum shavings from that process, so again, I'm going to go through and try to clean it all up after I do the other side too. I'm kind of worried about aluminum shavings getting in here. Maybe I'll put a piece of masking tape over that when I do this top one here. Now that I've taped off the connector for the ignition switch, I'm going to add just like a little bit of WD-40. I should have done this on the first one to the threads. I'm going to do that outside the car, but a little bit of WD-40 should help lubricate that, and hopefully some of the aluminum chips will kind of stick to the WD-40 and not necessarily fly everywhere. Let's give this a shot. Again, this would have been really nice to do outside the car because it does get pretty tight in here and it's hard to get it in, put some pressure on it and keep it straight. Again, hopefully if you watched this whole video before you started this process, so if you are installing a new part, you can address these holes ahead of time. Thankfully, these bolts do have a bit of a taper to the end, which almost leads me to believe that the intention was for them to cut their own threads. Either way, kind of a pain in the butt, if you ask me. Just like a tap, it'd probably help if I ran it kind of out a little bit and then back in. So yeah, let's just barf that out a little bit. All right, now that I've purged that out a little bit, I think it's clean. Not that it needs to be super clean because it is a blind hole. It doesn't go all the way through. Again, I highly recommend getting these holes tapped before installing. It just makes life a lot easier. And hopefully the rest is cake. Now, like most things, just get the first bolt run down, but not snug, so that you can still wiggle the component around to line up the other hole. Again, not too tight, snug. Snug is enough. Next up, let's snap the little EWS key sensor ring on. Don't forget the little rubber gasket that goes with it. I believe it lines up with this notch here in the casting. Following the reverse order of how we took it apart, put the ignition switch connector on, put a new zip tie here, plugged in the EWS key sensor ring. And this does fit kind of like loose on here, that's normal. For putting the stalks back on, to make life a little bit easier, I think I'm gonna put these bottom connectors on before I install it. And actually, might as well connect these while I'm in here as well. It's a little bit easier access. That one I'll wait because the wires are a bit short. So I get this slide on. Try not to spin this too much. And then now we just have the 4 Torx head here. It appears that these holes on the new part are also not tapped. So in looking at the old part, it looks like they weren't necessarily tapped with a machine tap per se. I think they may have been kind of tapped via the screw again, because these are very coarse-headed screws. So I'm hoping I can just drive those in, create the threads. Hopefully any aluminum shavings will be captive in that area. I will say this is probably a perk of using a used part, is that you don't have to tap all these holes. However, with the used part, you never know when that's going to wear out also. These aren't super thick screws, so I would kind of worry about snapping if you put too much torque on them. And that would not be fun. I'm seeing a few areas where there's some aluminum dust, so I'm going to strategically use my compressed air here to blow that away and right into my face. Something else I should have done while this is all apart, the wrap on these wires is obviously coming apart, so I'm just going to hit it with a fresh little rewrap using this Tessa tape. That way when it clips into this little clip here, it's not going to be rubbing and chafing and stuff like that. Much better. Now at this point you could put the steering wheel on first, or you could put the column covers on first. I'm going to opt for reinstalling the column covers first. This part wasn't included in my disassembly video because I'd already torn this apart after I encountered the issues. So for the bottom, and one thing I want to note, this is really nerdy, but I was going to replace my 2 clamshell pieces with some pieces that I pulled from my facelifted 4.8 IS that I parted out. However, in looking at these parts have kind of like a soft touch coating on them, which scratches easily and otherwise ends up not aging very well. And I noticed that the pre-facelift is just straight up plastic, so much easier to keep clean and scratches won't show up as easily. Also, I'd like to point out, this top fastener, it's like a little clip that when you put the screw in, you know, the screw kind of pushes those tangs out, holds it into place. From the factory, this is a plastic screw that really doesn't work that well. You know, you try to turn the head and the plastic kind of flexes and warps. I'm gonna replace that with a metal screw, and then I won't have that issue. So first step here on the bottom is to put all these little clips. There's 4 of them. One is broken on that side, but put all these clips in place, and then I would start with installing the top. But I do want to point out that this little screw hole here correlates to that little tab that we added there. So just like the bottom, you'll need to get these 4 clips back in place. Once you get these clips into place, you can see that there are tabs that lock into little features on that cast part. So we're going to swing that in. It helps if your battery is not disconnected. Helps if you pull the column all the way out, all the way down. Make sure you don't pinch any wires. This should swing right down into place. This little guy might pop out. So once you get this into place, you can pop this back in and then add that screw. Again, make sure these wires are tucked up in there. If they are kind of bulging out, they can kind of push up on this. So just kind of tuck those in there and everything should fit into place. I'm gonna add this little tab back into place. And then I'm gonna replace that plastic screw with this metal screw. With that top section in place, we can swing this up. You might have to shove it back, and it actually might help to raise things up a bit. So you want to clip that into place and then add that one torque screw on the bottom there. This can actually be kind of a pain, kind of tricky to get both sides to really close up properly. And again, maybe it's just worn out plastics, but I cannot quite get this side to really clip into place and stay there. But I'm hoping that once I tighten up the bottom here, I can kind of massage things into place a bit better. So again, the bottom, this long guy, this long torque screw, right in the bottom there. Next up, we'll throw the steering wheel back on. Again, there's a little line punched into the steering column. And that typically, if all things line up properly, aligns with, I don't know if you can see that, another little line on the steering wheel itself. So you want to line those up, put this in place, put the plugs in, make sure that these little pins align with these holes. Once you get the bolt started, you can go ahead and make these connections. I have an extra connection here for my heated steering wheel. Usually you'll only have 2 connections. And then these are for the airbag. So one little moment of truth here after doing the repair. We will turn the steering wheel here and see if it locks. It does lock, and honestly, the mechanical sensation of that steering wheel lock, so much smoother than before. You know, like a 20-year-old car, you might get like a kind of a loud clank, click sensation. This was just like a really buttery clicking sensation. So hey, that's cool. Now that it's locked, we can torque that bolt. It is a 16 millimeter, and they say to torque it to 46 to 48 foot-pounds. Once your bolt is torqued, we can reinstall the airbag. Again, make those 2 connections, pop it back on, and you're good to go. And that's it, pretty much done. Only thing left is the moment of truth. Sticking the key does go in the ignition, and we're gonna wiggle the steering wheel a little bit to unlock it. Good to go. So next up, I'm gonna take it for a test drive, obviously, and then clear my airbag light. But otherwise, it is fixed. Overall, also, the mechanism feels a lot more tight and, you know, not as sloppy. So, very stoked on that. Thanks for watching.